Hello, human geographers. We are back at it again this evening. Tonight, we are going to be talking about the cultural landscape and potential threats to it. So let's get started. Now, last lecture, we introduced a vocabulary term called the culture region. And its definition was this: a region defined by similar culture traits and cultural landscape features. And I mentioned last lecture that we would be talking about the cultural landscape, and now we are. So what is this cultural landscape? Well, before we get to that, let's start with cultural ecology. That's the big thing that we need to start with. Cultural ecology is defined as the study of the interaction between cultures or societies and the natural environments they occupy. So, the identification and analysis of the cultural landscape is part of cultural ecology. So what is this cultural landscape? It is the visible imprint of human activity and culture on the landscape. We can see it. The modifications to the environment by humans, including the built environment and agricultural systems that reflect aspects of culture. Now, we introduced a term there, built environment. So let's take a look at that. The man-made surroundings that provide the setting for human activity, ranging in scale from personal shelter, so like individual houses, that kind of stuff, to neighborhoods, as well as large-scale civic surroundings, cities. All right? So the cultural landscape looks at the built environment, all the stuff that we build, plus agricultural systems. In other words, the cultural landscape is the human imprint on the environment. It includes everything from how people have modified the physical environment to the buildings, the signs, fences, statues that people erect. It is the physical record of a given culture. Right? And so the built environment is the material culture element of this. And then we're going to see non-material culture factored into what we do, why we do it, where it's located, all that kind of stuff. All right? Now, the cultural landscape also gives us a record of different groups of people. And we call that sequential occupation. You may see it another way as sequence occupancy, but it's the same basic root. And what that is the use and modification of a place by successive cultural groups, reflecting different cultural values, technologies, social relations that together contribute to a cumulative cultural landscape. All right? So you might see areas that one group occupied over here, and then later another group came in and you can see another ring beyond it. All right? We're going to take a look at some examples of this. All right? I always describe this to students as if the way I always describe it, and it sounds kind of weird, but if I were to blindfold you and then just drop you off at some random place in the world, how would you know where you are? You'd take off your blindfold, you'd look around, and you would look at the cultural landscape, the signs, the buildings, the agriculture, everything to try and figure out where you are. Now, I fully expect there to be a multiple choice question every single year on this, where they just give you a picture and ask you where it is. They might use countries, they might use regions, but I fully expect that they would give you just a picture. And it could be an FRQ, but every single year I anticipate a multiple choice question where they will do that. So let's practice and take a look at some examples. So over the next few slides, I'm going to show you some of the cultural landscape features that exist around the world. And these come from the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, known as UNESCO. And these are World Heritage Sites. And I'm going to point out a couple of the features that we could use and understand and things like that. We just want to notice some of the differences. So for example, this one is in Afghanistan. This is the Bamiyan Valley. And this was the westernmost extent of Buddhism, or large extent of Buddhism. And there were two very famous statues of Buddha in this Bamiyan Valley. And in addition to that, it also shows the Islamic influences in other architecture that has happened afterwards. And so this is a really good example of that sequence occupancy. It was Buddhist, now it's Islamic. We're seeing differences in building types and religious structures and things like that. Now, in this particular valley in 2001, the Taliban actually destroyed those two statues of Buddha and actually made international news because this was a UNESCO heritage site and the Taliban destroyed these two features. Moving into Australia, okay, natural parks like this one in Australia where Ayers Rock is located are a way that countries will set aside land so that it's not developed, so cities and different things like that won't pop up here. And it's an attempt to often preserve unique landscapes, like Ayers Rock, for example. And the term that I want you guys to associate with this is ecotourism. And ecotourism is a concept where countries will try to promote the conservation of unique and endangered spaces by protecting it and then allowing people to come in and witness it and maybe pay money to visit it. So that helps with the conservation of it. And so national parks are a really good way, good cross-section with ecotourism. And it also happens to be a cross-section with sustainable development as well. One really identifiable feature of the cultural landscape are landmarks. There's some really identifiable landmarks from around the world that people would see and they would instantly know where that is located. Whether you're talking about the Eiffel Tower in Paris, or the Taj Mahal in India, or the Statue of Liberty in New York City. This is another one. This is a statue in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, and it is known as Christ the Redeemer. And it is a statue that overlooks Rio as well as the bay upon which it sits. And in addition to being a really identifiable landmark, it also gives us a sense of the religion in this particular area. It's so important to day-to-day life that they are willing to build a massive monument to the founder of their faith. So let's take a look at another example. This one comes to us from Nova Scotia, Canada. And if you had looked at it, you might have actually guessed that it was in France. You see the church, you see the cross, you see the flag. But this is a part of Canada where a group called the Acadians live. And they are descendants of, you guessed it, French colonists. And religious structures are a really good piece of the cultural landscape. Flags are a good piece of the cultural landscape. Now the flag in this case is kind of misleading because what looks like the French flag is actually the Acadian flag. And it basically uses the French flag as a base and adds a 5-pointed yellow star on the blue vertical bar that's on the hoist side. This is Cuba, and it's the Vinales Valley, which is largely agricultural, and the prime agricultural commodity in this part of Cuba is tobacco. All right, so you notice the vegetation. Notice it kind of looks like a tropical climate, so that might give us an indication of where in the world we might be. So we're talking lower latitude areas. Notice the architecture. Notice the cross at the top of the building. All right, that is a Catholic cross. And so that would help us to narrow down what part of the world we would be examining. This next one comes from Kenya. And this is the Mijikenda Kaya Forest, which is part of the coastal part of Kenya. These were fortified villages, but most of the villages were actually abandoned in the mid-20th century, but they have been preserved. And it shows that the cultural landscape can change. Because what were residences up until the mid-20th century now serve as something different. It serves a spiritual purpose. And so the homes, the graves, the groves of kaya trees have been preserved. And so it's sacred and it serves as the site of rituals and pilgrimages for many different people who will come to this area to be a part of a spiritual experience. This is Indonesia, and in particular, it is the Bali province of Indonesia. Now, some of the facts about Bali and Indonesia in general. Indonesia is the most populous Muslim country on earth. There are more Muslims living in Indonesia than any other country on earth. But Bali is actually predominantly Hindu. Now, in this particular image, we're focusing less about the religion and more about the agricultural systems. Remember that agriculture is part of the cultural landscape. So notice terracing, the intensive use of land, maximizing the plots of land so that they can grow. In this case, we see flooded fields. This is intensive wet rice farming. And so we might be able to look at this image and make a prediction about where in the world that it is based on the fact that we see terracing, we see flooded fields, we see a tropical climate. That might give us a greater sense about where in the world that this is located. Our next example are the Persian Gardens of Iran. Now, the Persian Gardens were meant to represent paradise on earth or Eden on earth. And we're going to see elements of Islamic influences, we'll get to that in a second, as well as Zoroastrianism. Now, Zoroastrianism was a historical religious practice that we find in what is now the modern state of Iran. But Iran is a Muslim country, and in particular, the Shia or Shiite branch of Islam. And it's important to note that buildings that reflected Islamic culture, you will not see the human or animal form depicted. You will almost certainly not see the image of God depicted, and the same goes for the Prophet Muhammad. But generally speaking, you won't see human or animal forms depicted. But that is a generalization because this tends to be a practice more associated with the Sunni branch of Islam. But it is a trend that we see in Islamic architecture that instead of the human form, you're more likely to see elaborate geometric patterns, patterns of colors, as well as shapes. And we can see that here. Our next example here is Japan. And this is a sacred site in Japan, and in particular showcasing elements of Shintoism, which is an ethnic religion found in Japan. And within Shintoism, a lot of the focus is on nature and worshiping elements of nature. At this particular site, which is on the Kii Mountains, it's illustrating how sacred the mountains themselves are. In fact, this has been a sacred site for over 1,200 years and still attracts almost 15 million visitors a year, many of whom are on a pilgrimage to come to a sacred site and experience something sacred. All right? But in other parts of Japan, you'll also see elements that reflect Buddhism, which is a universalizing religion, as well as Shintoism, which is an ethnic religion typically found in Japan, because they're very uniquely intertwined there. Our next example comes to us from Madagascar, and this is the royal hill of Amboamanga, which is a royal city and burial site, and is considered sacred to many of the Malagasy who live here. All right. Now, it has fortified stone gateways. It utilizes the physical environment, as well as having many sacred fountains, basins, as well as sacrificial stones. And the trees here are considered royal trees. And it reflects the really strong national identity that many Malagasy have and attracts many, many pilgrims each year. Our next example comes from New Zealand, and this is the Tongariro National Park. And within the park, the mountains that are at the center of this park have very important and cultural significance to the Maori people of New Zealand. And you can see the Maori here in the foreground. You can see some of the unique architecture behind them. And the Maori are an indigenous population, part of larger Polynesian culture. And so notice the architecture, notice the traditional dress of the people that are in this picture. That is part of the cultural landscape. And our final example comes from the Alto Douro region of Portugal. Now, let me ask, can you guess the type of agriculture that is practiced here? You drop it off, you take your blindfold off, you see these rows. What type of agriculture do you think this is? because this is Mediterranean agriculture, and in particular, the Alta Douro region has produced wine for nearly 2,000 years. So those are grapevines. This is an area that is known for its wine, especially its port wine. And so remember, agricultural systems part of the cultural landscape because it's a way that humans modify the landscape in different ways, right? So it's the built environment as well as agriculture. Shifting gears a little bit, we're going to wrap up our culture lectures by examining some of the threats that exist for folk culture. Now, our textbook identifies these 5 specific threats, but I'm going to be referencing a lot of other examples from a variety of other sources to support the claims that were made by our textbook. So let's take a look at them. The first of our threats is foreign media imperialism. Essentially what we mean by that is that most of the news, TV, movies, music are coming largely from these 3 areas, the US, the UK, and Japan. 3 countries that, generally speaking, embody what we would call Western culture. So, the lifestyles that you see portrayed in movies and music, talked about in the news, the language that is used, are generally Western lifestyles. And so, that may not necessarily mesh with the values that are present in other countries. Our textbook talks about LDCs, but it doesn't necessarily have to be LDCs. For example, to try and slow down the diffusion of American and British media, the French government has heavily subsidized, helped pay for, the French film industry. In fact, French television has to give 3% of their revenue to the French film industry. And the French government also tried to slow down the spread of American and British music on the radio by setting a limit during the 1990s that said that 40% of on-air radio time in France had to be in French, had to be in a specific language. And so it's essentially talking about how different cultures may not necessarily mesh with one another. And so that relates to ethnocentrism. We talked about that in the first lecture, about how it's evaluating other cultures based on the perspective of our own culture. That was the glasses that we talked about in the first lecture. And so it could be offensive, it could be subversive, the type of culture that's being heavily broadcast. And so there are a few counterexamples though. And so I'm going to look at the news, I'm going to look at movies, I'm going to look at music. And Al Jazeera, which is a news organization owned by the government of Qatar, is an example of a news outlet that isn't coming from one of these 3 major countries. As far as movies go, India and Bollywood films are an example of films that are very popular, not coming from these 3 specific countries. And as far as music goes, South Korea is an interesting example because a lot of popular music coming out of South Korea. Our next threat to folk culture is cultural change as cultures interact with one another. Now, cultural change and the loss of cultural traditions has been a part of all of human history, but it's becoming more common over the last 500 years or so. One of the approved Human Geo textbooks estimates that at least 1/3 of the world's inventory of human cultures has totally disappeared since the year 1500, along with their languages, their traditions, their ways of life, their identity, and really perhaps any knowledge or memory of their existence. For example, as the population of Brazil has expanded into the interior of that country and into the rainforest, many indigenous populations are encountering popular culture, perhaps for the first time. And so typically, younger people are integrating into modern Brazilian society. So as those younger indigenous populations leave their communities, they're more likely to accept popular culture while abandoning their indigenous cultural heritage, which can threaten the existence of folk culture. Now, this gives us an opportunity to talk about some of the different vocabulary terms associated with cultural change. Those are assimilation, acculturation, multiculturalism, and syncretism. So here we go. Acculturation is cultural modification or change that results when one culture, group, or individual adopts certain customs of a dominant or host society. Cultural development or change through borrowing, also known as cultural appropriation. The key part there, adopt certain customs. We're going to come back to that in a moment. And if we boil it down to a single word, it's borrowing. You're pulling pieces of it. It's not everything. That would be assimilation. Assimilation is everything. A process by which a minority population reduces or loses completely its identifying cultural characteristics and blends into the host society. So that minority population is erased. They're gone. And that's what that Human Geo textbook was talking about with the losing a third of the world's cultural groups. The next one isn't one of our vocabulary terms, but it's important, and that is multiculturalism, the coexistence of several cultures in one society. It's several. It's being able to speak one language at school and another one at home. I'll talk about that in a sec. And then syncretism, the blending of traits from two different cultures to form a new trait. You're creating something new. So let's look at an example. All right, so let's take a look at a visual to help us with this. Now, I had a former student tell me once that she remembered acculturation because it starts with the letters ACC, which stands for adopts certain customs. And if you take a look at the definition on the last slide, you'll notice that that was the key part of the definition. So in this particular visual, the head is blue, the body is yellow, because they've adopted some things, not everything. And of course, I'm assuming that this is a person with a head and a body and not just the letter I. Now, assimilation takes place when a minority group can no longer be distinguished from the receiving group. So when the blue culture and the yellow culture meet, the blue culture disappears. Now, a historical example of this can be seen in the policies of the US government towards its indigenous population. Now, the policy of assimilation was an attempt to make American Indians into Americans rather than Indians. And the US wasn't alone in this. Canada, Australia, Russia adopted very similar policies towards their indigenous populations, using schools, churches, government agents, among other things, to try and discourage native practices entirely. And then our last one on here is syncretism, which is about blending together to get something new. In this visual, blue and yellow gives us something new, green. Now, an example of syncretism can be found in the diffusion of voodoo cultural practices from West Africa to the Americas by enslaved persons. It thrived in areas like Haiti and Louisiana, but over the years it absorbed influences from French and Spanish Catholicism, Native American spiritual practices, along with other traditions to create an entirely new culture complex. So what we're looking at next is the loss of traditional values. Typically, in folk cultures, as well as in areas that are relatively less developed, people have very defined gender roles, as we're going to see on the next slide. Women typically take care of the household, while men will work outside the home, earn money, as well as serve as leaders in areas like religion and politics. Now, in popular culture, we've been seeing that gender-specific roles are diminishing. So as popular culture spreads, women will often seek new roles in education, employment, and politics. But, it should be noted, that we've also seen that as popular culture spread, we've seen the exploitation of women increase as well. We'll take a look at that here in a moment. Now, another example of this could be the Plains Indians of North America. In the early 1800s, Plains Indian tribes migrated during the year based on where the bison were. They made tools, shelter, and clothing out of the bison. They held dances and ceremonies that surrounded the bison hunt. But with the near extinction of the bison, challenges to try and maintain customs that were associated with a near extinct animal became far more problematic, and maintaining cultural values and cultural traditions were threatened. All right, so let's take a look at some evidence and examples of what we were just talking about. The next two slides come from what is called the Women's Stats Project. And this particular slide looks at the discrepancy, the gap between male and female secondary school enrollment. Now, before we get started, let me ask, what type of map are we looking at? At what scale are we analyzing this? And is this discrepancy a good indicator of development? And hopefully you said that this is a Quadruplet map at the national scale, and that yes, it is based on development. That countries where there isn't a gap, where boys and girls are enrolled in secondary school at about the same rate, those are areas that are more developed. Now, gender segregated schools are actually another element of the cultural landscape, creating what we call gendered space. If countries have gender segregated schools and have more schools for boys than for girls, this can create a huge disparity between enrollments of boys and girls in school. Now, as popular culture diffuses, we tend to see traditional gender roles, like who can go to school and when and for how long, reduced. At the same time, as popular culture diffuses, we have seen the exploitation of women increase in certain regards. One example of this exploitation can be seen in the trafficking of women. Women's Stats Project identified the trafficking of women as one particular area where the exploitation of women has become more prevalent as Western culture has diffused. Now, why might that be? And I don't know the answer. So think about it. Our next threat is placelessness. Now, popular culture is characterized by uniformity over large geographic spaces. And in fact, popular culture often changes more over time than it does over space. So, if every place looks the same, how can any place be unique? That's placelessness. Placelessness is the loss of uniqueness of place in the cultural landscape so that one place looks like the next. And it's otherwise known as a uniform landscape. In other words, placelessness is the standardization of space that diminishes regional distinctiveness and, according to one of the approved textbooks, demeans the human spirit. Now, one theory that explains this is known as the convergence hypothesis, and it suggests that cultures are converging and becoming more alike. Globalization and cultural diffusion have led to the convergence of cultural landscapes worldwide. And there are three developments that are really at the heart of this. The first is that certain architectural styles have diffused around the world. An example, skyscrapers. The second development is that individual businesses are so widespread that they leave a distinctive imprint on far distant places. Think McDonald's and Starbucks and Apple. And the final development that's contributing to the convergence of the cultural landscape is the borrowing of idealized landscape images, which promotes a blurring of distinctiveness, what is truly distinctive. And we can look at the Las Vegas Strip as an example. Right? We've got the Statue of Liberty, you've got the canals of Venice, you got the pyramids, you've got a medieval castle. How is any place unique if every place it has characteristics of one another? The final threat to folk culture is environmental degradation. Remember that folk culture depends heavily on the local environment for many, many things. Popular culture is far less dependent on the local environment. We talked earlier about ecotourism as a strategy to help protect unique and endangered landscapes. But these areas are still at risk. Combined with that, 85% of national parks and other protected areas in Central America and 80% in South America have resident indigenous populations. So as these areas are threatened, so too are there indigenous populations that are found there. Combined with that, a geographer named Paul Richards documented that many indigenous populations have very subtle but very extensive knowledge about local soils, climate, and plant life that popular culture industries may not know. In addition, the high mass consumption of popular culture often leads to environmental impacts like the pollution of air, soil, and water, as well as just solid waste. And even tourists that are going to national parks are overtaxing the environment and producing levels of traffic congestion that approach the levels that we see in urban areas. Now, a couple examples that we could use of popular culture modifying the physical environment includes golfing and recreational vehicles. Golf extensively modifies the landscape. Now, I don't know if you guys knew this, but golf courses are not naturally occurring landscapes in Nevada. The picture that you see there is from Mesquite in Clark County, Nevada. Now, recreational vehicles like snowmobiles, off-road vehicles like ATVs, jet skis, they're all powered by internal combustion engines that have a number of adverse ecological effects, ranging from air pollution to just soil erosion. That's where we leave off tonight. I will see you guys back in class tomorrow. Have a wonderful evening. Good night.